Hi everyone. This is a quick video on how to read for law students. Obviously you know how to read, but reading in law requires a really different skill set, and there are some things that really you learn from experience that it's probably a good idea to try and pass on to others. Because one of the worst things you can do in law is to try and read it like you'd read, say, a novel or even other types of textbooks where you read in a very linear way. You start at the beginning, you work your way through to a part that you don't understand, and then you go back and you read it again and again and again, and very quickly you get frustrated. So I'm not sure any of these are magic solutions, but hopefully these are tips that you'll find useful. One thing you will have noticed already is there's a lot of reading involved in law, but there's also a lot of shortcuts. People give you textbooks to read, and then they give you lecture slides. There are cases, but there are head notes. There are case books with summaries, and it does. You might be asking yourself, well, what gives? If all this reading is important, how come you give us so many shortcuts? Well, I suppose there are two things you need to be doing when you're reading the law. One is finding the answer, which is why the shortcuts exist, and the other is familiarising yourself with the way that law works, the way things are organised, the way you find things, the way that lawyers express themselves. And that's the reason why we try to give you more reading and try to ask you to do more reading. It's not because we're trying to hide the answers. It's not because we don't want you to take the shortcuts, but we want you to be able to understand how it all fits together. So think about legislation. If you look at one section of legislation, it makes no sense at all by itself. It may do in some lecture notes where we say, "I'll check section 54 of the Act." Oh, okay, that's what it says. But you really need to read the rest of the legislation for that to make sense. The same goes with other legal sources you'll be reading. It's really important that you understand the genre, the form of expression, the kinds of phrases that are used. Not just for your study, but in practice, where you won't necessarily have a textbook to take you to the right answer straight away. You might not automatically have an answer to a question. You might find yourself in a position where you're suddenly reading appeal cases and without someone holding your hand. And this is where these skills become very important. The other thing is, one of the things to be aware of is that some people think of learning as just transfer of content. You take a whole lot of things you need to learn and you put them into your brain, either by reading a book or listening to a lecture. And we know that's not how people learn, particularly in the 21st century with the internet and so on. Learning is more about learning a way of thinking, the way information is organised, and the way we access information. So it's not just about the content, and let's face it, most of the content of a subject you're going to lose immediately after the exam. You forget most of what you know of it from a subject straight after the exam, and then it very quickly drops off even further. And even if that wasn't true, in law, the law changes all the time. So what we're coming at here is thinking about your study as not just filling you up with information and knowledge, but changing the way you think and getting you to understand the way that this community of lawyers actually express themselves, so you can actually get involved and you have those skills that will last you a lifetime rather than just get you through your studies. Okay, so a few points. First of all, active reading. Reading, if you're reading a novel you like, it's great to sort of sit under a tree and relax and read through it. You'll know by now that you can't really get anywhere with legal material that way. You'll hit blocks pretty soon. Pretty soon your mind will drift away and you realise you've been rereading the same page 5 times. Some people, of course, love reading law. Michael Kirby very famously has a couple of law reports by the side of the bed and reads through them before he goes to sleep. Most of the rest of us aren't that interested in law. We're interested professionally, but we also have other things on our bedside to read. So what do I mean by active reading? Active reading is reading with a plan, knowing what you're going into a reading process for, and focusing on what you need to get out of it. So it's about starting out by understanding, well, why am I reading this? What information do I need? What am I supposed to find out? Skimming through, not worrying too much about it making sense the first time through, and then going back for detail. Look back to your plan. when I started reading this, I thought I was going to understand this. Do I understand that? Let's go back. But that skimming skill is really important, because quite often in legal text you'll hit things that you don't quite get that relate to something else, and quite often they're not all that important. And you need to develop that sense of judgment for yourself to know when it's okay to skim and when you have to really focus on that and say, no, I actually really need to understand this. But the important part of active reading is that it's not a start at the beginning, move through to the end approach. You actually skim, go back, go forward. You're very actively engaged with it. It's important you make notes as you do it, because making notes, again, gives you that sense of progress and gives you an understanding of how those thoughts are shaping. And again, it stops you doing that thing where you kind of drift off and then you realise 10 minutes have gone past and you've looked out the window and you've really not really sort of digested anything. We all do that. And I mentioned earlier that there are shortcuts in law, there are head notes and slides and so on. You also use those as part of active reading. When you finish reading something, have a look at those shortcuts and go, okay, now did I get that? Did I get that? And use that as a check. So don't start out with the shortcuts necessarily, although they may help you answer those questions as to what you're looking for. But start out with a blank page, start out with a plan, work your way through, and make sure you are actively engaged in reading. Now, in terms of the other, the kind of sources you'll be using in law, how does that active reading work? Well, in textbooks, we'll look at textbooks, cases, and legislation. Textbooks err on the side of comprehensiveness. Okay, they when you're writing a textbook, you think, is everyone ever going to need to know this? Oh, well, I better put it in just in case. So you'll find they tend to have a lot of things, particularly in the case summary department, of strange scenarios that may occur. They may never occur in practice. Most of these things will never occur in your professional life, but we put them in anyway. So you need to be very mission focused with your active reading with textbooks. You need to know, what is it I need to know? What are the things that are pertaining to my assessment? What are the things pertaining to my knowledge of this area? An analogy that I think is quite useful is JB Hi-Fi. If you go into JB Hi-Fi with a mission, knowing there's a particular album you want to get and you want to pick it up and you want to get it, you can get in and out there with 10 minutes and you can get it all done. But if you go into JB Hi-Fi thinking, I'll have a look around and I'll just see what's there, you'll find you've spent an hour in there and you've bought 6 CDs that you didn't know you wanted, and in fact you probably don't want, but they were on special, and you've kind of gone off topic. So think about reading a text very much as like going into JB Hi-Fi. You've got to have that mission, you've got to stay focused and don't get distracted. That being said, make sure you when things are interesting, you do go down those interesting side paths and you do explore, but don't do that at the cost of your overall understanding. Okay, cases. Let's look at cases for a second. The big problem with reading cases is the basic question of who is the audience of a case. And let's face it, it's not you and it's not me. The prime audience of a case are the parties who are involved in that case, and they're going to have a whole lot more knowledge of the background, the facts, previous proceedings that you and I don't have. They're things that are unreported, or they're summarised very, very vaguely. And I know when I started studying law, I thought case reports would be these wonderful, comprehensive, starting with all the facts, and you'd understand everything that goes on. And I was quite disappointed that most of the time you're really thrown in the deep end. So again, active reading, mission focused. What do you need to know about this? One of the ways in which cases can have all these sort of unnecessary side trips in them is that they're not confined to one area of law. And it might be set as a case for you to read because we want to talk about this one particular area of contract law. And there's a whole area of taxation law and succession law and everything else in there. And that may be irrelevant to your present purpose. And you need to be active in the ability to go, well, okay, that stuff's there. I'll skim through it to get the basic idea of what it says, but I really don't need to understand that. But reading cases, it's a really important skill. It's really important to understand the phrases, the form of expression that lawyers use, and particularly the careful way that sentences are structured. It can seem really impenetrable at times, but usually that's because people are being very careful with the way they structure what they're saying, because when creating precedents, you don't want ambiguity. Okay, and the last thing I want to look at is legislation, and that comment about ambiguity is twice as important with legislation. Legislation is drafted in a more general way than legislation. Legislation looks forwards to future conflicts. Cases look backward. They're looking at a specific case, looking at specific facts, and they're resolving that. And there's a bit of a view to precedent, a bit of a view to saying, okay, we want to set a precedent that's going to be usable in the future, but the primary purpose of a case is something that's already happened. For legislation, it's things that might happen, or they're going to happen, or they'll soon happen, or they won't happen, but we've got to be careful in case they do. Reading legislation is a really important skill, and it's one of the areas that the courts in particular are telling us as teachers that that young lawyers don't know how to do. In some ways, if you've done any software coding, legislation looks more like a piece of software than it does a piece of text, because it's ordered, it's connected, it's in sections that connect to one another. It's a very interesting form of expression, usually a very boring way, but the style of it's very interesting. So remember the rules of statutory interpretation that you've learned when you're looking at legislation. Think about, well, why are they expressing it in this very strange, sort of weird roundabout way? And you'll usually find it's about trying to get rid of ambiguity, trying to express something clearly without that sense of ambiguity. Also, what I said about skimming before, just as important with legislation, that micro-macro zooming. Your contents are your best friend here, because you can see the overall patterns of how the legislation works, how the pieces of it fit together, and you zoom back and forth. You look at the contents, check them very carefully to know where you're at when you're reading sections. And while we're at it, another tip I think for legislation is print it out. Don't use a digital version. Use a printout version, because you won't see how things fit together properly if you're just zooming back up and down on a digital document. I think, I'm all in favour of saving the trees and everything else, but when it comes to a working knowledge of legislation, make sure you have it printed out so you can flip back and forth very quickly and see, okay, what's that? That's this section. Which section is this? How does that all fit together? Okay, so that is not going to solve all your problems with reading, I'm sure, but hopefully there's a few tips there that'll be useful to you, and they'll give you some idea of what it is that we're looking for, and what the experience of being someone who's been reading law for quite a few years, how that experience can be useful to people who are just starting out that process. Okay.